And I think the Forever War is uniquely written by somebody. You can read it and you can see that Joe Haldeman went to Vietnam. And that colors everything he says in that book. Robert Heinlein didn't go to Vietnam. He has a very different view of the problem, a World War II view of the problem, if you will. And so another way to look at it would be Starship Troopers is a novel born of the Second World War, and the Forever War is a novel really born of Vietnam.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's Really Happening, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, the Strategy and Research Manager at GNSI. Joining me today, as always on What's Really Happening, is retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. He's the Executive Director of GNSI and the former Commander of the United States Central Command. I've been looking forward to this show for a while as we're going to get a unique perspective on two very influential fiction books. We're going to talk about The Forever War by Joe Haldeman and Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. Neither of these books is new. Starship Troopers was published in 1959, and Haldeman wrote The Forever War over 50 years ago in 1974. We're looking forward to get the General's perspective on these very influential military reads. So welcome back, General.
Ted, always good to be here.
So we're going to talk about these two fascinating novels, which is military sci-fi, going back to really the beginning. So as we look at Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers and then Joe Haldeman's The Forever War, can you tell us a little bit why we need to talk about these books today, both of them being published, mid-last century?
They tell us what it's like for humanity to confront an existential problem. And two very different solutions present themselves, one in The Forever War, the other one in Starship Troopers. And so they also are well to be read side by side because they're very different in terms of their approaches to how humanity solves this problem.
And as you mentioned, it's a bigger problem than just the military. It's anyone could read these books and take some lessons away.
So both books, extensive social commentary, talk about the way society develops under pressure, and then again, two very different paths are chosen.
And let's talk a little bit about those paths of the different perspectives that we get from Heinlein and then Haldeman. So Heinlein is a little bit older. He was born in 1907. He was a naval officer. What's that perspective like in Starship Troopers compared to the specter of Haldeman, who was an infantryman in Vietnam?
So Heinlein graduated from the Naval Academy in 1929 and served as a Navy officer before having to leave service because he contracted tuberculosis. Otherwise, I think it's very possible Heinlein might have stayed in the Navy. We'll never know, and probably a loss to the Navy because he had to get out. Nonetheless, he got out and did a variety of things in engineering and actually continued to contribute to the war effort in the Second World War. But he also picked up writing and was considered by many to be the dean of early American science fiction, certainly the hard science fiction side. But his approach to it is that of a Navy officer and really that of a civil libertarian. And that's the commentary he brings to it. He values citizenship, and he thinks that citizenship should be proven, not simply granted by right of birth. And that's an interesting concept, and certainly one worth talking about at greater length, perhaps in some other venue. But in Starship Troopers, in order to gain citizenship in a world federation, you have to perform government service. And in this case, the world is our humanity is actually bumping up against an alien race, and they fight the alien race for domination across the galaxy.
And we see actually some similar themes, but also different themes in the Forever War. So what's that different perspective we're getting in the Forever War? So we're not getting that citizenship for service type concept. We're getting something much different.
No, you could scope Starship Troopers as a more idealistic picture of the future, whereas the Forever War has a little bit of dystopia in it. People don't get a choice actually about going in the military. They choose the best and the brightest to fight off planet for the survival of the race. Much the same way that you do in Starship Troopers, except it's not a voluntary process. And both novels sketch a very violent, complex series of infantry battles on distant planets. Different approaches to both, but still both very good in each their own way. But there's a lot to choose from between the two. I mean, as I've already said in Starship Troopers, you volunteer. You go because you want to go and because of what it brings. In the Forever War, you're conscripted and you stay until the end. And not very many people are going to stay till the end. It's like the probability of living through a tour of duty as a bomber crew in the Second World War. If you do the math, you're not going to get there.
Right. Right, and as you noted, in Starship Troopers, the military in that case actually has to take you if you volunteer, and they'll just give you a job based off of your level of ability. But in the Forever War, like I said, you're drafted, and you think that's more of the time of the authors compared to Vietnam. Even though you were drafted in World War II, is it a different sense?
It's different. I think what happened in 1950, and remember in 1959 when Heinlein wrote Starship Troopers, we actually still had a draft during that period of time. But again, I think Heinlein is a little more idealized in his approach to the problem than Haldeman, who's very stark and dark, frankly, the way he approaches the problem.
Well, and interesting enough, as they both approach this problem, they take very similar themes. So both are set in space, both are fighting this alien race, which, looking at the Forever War, they don't even know what the alien race looks like or where they're communicating at. And then they have to go out and fight this war. They don't know how long it's going to last, and they don't even know necessarily what it's going to look like.
That's right. And how they grapple with it is a testimony to each author's view of the future. I think in Starship Troopers, we see a unified response to it. And of course, the enemy is cast as bug-like creatures. It's xenophobia at an extreme, and very as different from humanity as you can imagine. And they never actually bridge the gap. Of course, in the Forever War, they're also very different creatures than what we are as human beings. But ultimately, we determine over the course of thousands of years of fighting, and that's very well developed in Joe Haldeman's book because he pays attention to the physics of space-time travel. Heinlein chooses to ignore that elegantly by ignoring it. But in the Forever War, you could have 20 years of subjective time and cross 800 years of objective time. So the races grow together, and we determine that actually we're not that much different from them. And of course, we change considerably too, moving toward them. Whereas in Starship Troopers, we don't. Ultimately, the last scene of the book, we're defeating the bugs, as they're called. It's the final campaign to do that.
Well, and that's one big difference between the two books that you definitely have to talk about is the timeline. So in Starship Troopers, the timeline's linear. You don't have any jumps in time. But in the Forever War, you actually have that idea of time, being adapted by the theory of relativity. And obviously his background as a physicist makes a difference there and being able to calculate that.
I think it's one of the key differences in the book between the two books, because in the Forever War, you're able actually to distinguish the development of humanity over the path of of 1,000 years or more, which you don't do in the Forever War. Forever War and Starship Troopers, humanity stays about the same because we're dealing really with a period of just a few years. In the Forever War, the period is many hundreds and then into thousands of years over the course of the campaign because of the imposition of relativistic time travel.
Right. And so in that case, in the book, they could be on a campaign, and although in their own time, it's only 6 months, back on Earth, it could be tens to hundreds of years.
That is correct. And so that's what allows, I think that's the mechanism that Joe Haldeman uses in his book to show how humanity is changing as it goes forward. And that's true. Humanity and the human race is not going to stay the same. We're going to be affected by the things we bump up against, by the things we fight, as well as the things that we absorb. So in that sense, because he's able to deal in deep time, he's able to address those issues. Heinlein doesn't have to address those issues because he doesn't deal with relativistic issues in his space travel.
Well, and that tool of being able to use time like that really gives you a sense of a soldier coming home too. So they're being able to show these soldiers that are gone on Earth, 100 years has passed or a few decades have passed. So you come home, everything's changed. Your relationships with your family has changed. Their lives have gone on. Well, in this case, these soldiers are all fighting in a far away, galaxy. But it shows you that you feel like an alien in your own home. I
think you're absolutely right. And we see in Joe Haldeman's book, the protagonists go back to Earth. They find it's very different, not very comfortable, and actually re-enlist or come back into service as a result of that. And then ultimately, when the campaign's over at the end of the book, they don't come back to Earth. They go to a distant planet in order to live, and it has a happy ending, but it's a happy ending on a distant planet.
Right, and it's that sense I think maybe he was channeling from Vietnam, coming home from Vietnam, feeling that you're not really part of the society anymore, and you almost, the only place you feel comfortable is in the military. I
think that's a great point, Tad. I think alienation is certainly a theme of Joe Haldeman's, and he works it beautifully in the book, and he's able to do that again and express it because of the gaps in time that he shows, which allows him to show a society that's developing and changing. Soldiers are not, because they're trapped in a much more in a different timeline, if you will.
Right. Yeah, literally in the book, they're in a different timeline. And the only people who've shared that experience, so the main protagonist there, William Mandela, the only person he can really relate to towards the end of the book is a woman named Mary Gay, who was there during those initial times. And she shared roughly the same time period as him. And he even says towards the end, he's like, that's the only person I can relate to because she's the only one who was there. And in this army, men and women are fighting together. So it's like, this is the only person I can relate to. It's maybe something similar we see in the military just in general.
I think that's an enduring thing.
And we don't see that necessarily in Starship Troopers in the sense of that time gap because everyone's kind of fighting. You lose a lot of people, but
there is a sense of elitism in Starship Troopers. That's why the book appeals to military audiences. I think for many years, and the Marine Corps still may have it on its reading list. I haven't looked at that reading list in a while. And it's a good book, but as I tell people when if you read Starship Troopers, you need to read the Forever War too. The books need to be read together because they give you two views of the same problem, and that's why they're so valuable. They're both very good independently, but taken together, they support each other and give you a couple of different points of view to take a look at.
No, absolutely. And they do have some other commonalities. So we talked about, obviously, they're in space, they're fighting these alien races, but some of the other things is the use of violence, even in training. So you have a lot of training deaths, and they're able to, in a sense, absorb those deaths and deal with them much different than we would today. We tend to be more risk adverse. Is that you think the author's trying to show us just the brutality of military life, or what? Well,
military life's difficult. It doesn't have to be brutal. You can be effective and not be brutal in training. I think both of them. Yes, I think that is the case in both. But I think it's also, in to some degree, a case of artistic license. Sure. I'm not sure it would be that casualty producing. Of the two, I find the Forever War a little more believable because they stress the difficulty of the different locations you're working, different planets you go on that are inherently deadly, where atmospheric conditions become as much a threat as anything else.
Right. Yeah, and they talk about how their suits are able to adapt, even different camouflage based on where you're working.
That's correct.
On. So they're training on a moon of Pluto, which is very cold, and then they're in a more tropical environment as they go through and fight. So both of these obviously involve war, but there are some other differences as well. While you have a lot more romance story in the Forever War, we have these two characters coming together, and Starship Troopers really just focus on Johnny Rico, the main character, going through his career. What do you think the difference is there when we're looking at leadership from the two?
So Hyland was a Navy officer. His approach is officer-like as he examines the problem. And the protagonist is an officer. Eventually, he's an officer as he goes through and progresses. So I think that's sort of his view on it. The Forever War is a grunt's eye view of it. He becomes an officer too, actually a higher-ranking officer than Heinlein's protagonist. But nonetheless, he never loses the sense of being a grunt. And I think the Forever War is uniquely written by somebody. You can read it and you can see that Joe Haldeman went to Vietnam. And that colors everything he says in that book. Robert Heinlein didn't go to Vietnam. He has a very different view of the problem, a World War II view of the problem, if you will. And so another way to look at it would be Starship Troopers is a novel born of the Second World War, and the Forever War is a novel really born of Vietnam.
Right, and you can see that play out with how they approach the conduct.
How they approach the problems, how they lead, how the fighting is described, everything.
Yeah, because both the main characters were enlisted first and kind of worked their way through the ranks, which is interesting because you see that progression of responsibility and then also the way they're commanding and leading their troops in these foreign planets. Some of the other interesting points of both books and the conflicts that they're fighting is how they use weaponry. So both nuclear weapons play or large-scale mass destruction weapons plays a major role in both books because surely the authors had that on the forefront of their mind given what was going on during the Cold War.
You're right, and both use a whole variety of weapons. I think Heinlein does a very good job for writing in 1959 of talking about how people might be fighting in the future. A little easier for Joe Haldeman, and both we need to remember had technical backgrounds. Heinlein had a degree from the Naval Academy. That's a Bachelor of Science degree in engineering, whatever else other degree he had, and I believe Haldeman was trained as a physicist. So they both brought a healthy technical background to the things that they describe, and that informs all their descriptions.
Absolutely. But, and both still go back to the infantry and where you need the infantry despite having these mass weapons. They talk about the value of you might not need to just destroy a planet. You might need to occupy it. And coincidentally, both of them have a mission where their whole goal is going on to raiding a planet and capturing alive the enemy, the alien force that they're fighting. And that means that even though you have these massive weapons, nuclear weapons, you need to be able to have infantrymen to go in and do these smaller tasks?
Well, Chad, that's an argument that I would embrace. I think ultimately you have to put people on the ground if you want to control terrain. You can do a lot to terrain without putting people on the ground, but you can't control it. You can't farm it. You can't impose your own system on it unless you put something on the ground to actually do that. And that just continues along as the airspace, it's the air power argument writ large. It's the sea power argument writ large. And both of them sort of play it out. Heinlein probably a little more explicitly because he came from that, but Haldeman more implied, but nonetheless, both of them capture it very neatly.
Right, because they're going through, I think at the time, you looked at the late 50s and through the 60s, the movement away from mutually assured destruction strategy of we're just going to use nukes in real life to that more flexible response of the Kennedy in the 60s. And you're seeing that you still need conventional forces, you still need infantrymen.
Absolutely.
Despite those nuclear weapons. But what about the leadership components of the characters? So you see obviously this kind of harsh leadership, the reliance on responsibility and discipline, but how do you see that playing out in each of the books?
Probably Starship Trooper is a better leadership study. It's a little more balanced. It's a little less dark. You see leadership developed. You see this young man go from being a private soldier to a sergeant, ultimately to being a lieutenant in combat. And you learn and Heinlein gives very classic leadership. It's a very classic approach of leadership there. First you're a follower, then you become someone in charge, but you can't do that unless you can do the jobs of your subordinates. So it's a very classic study of leadership. In the Forever War, it's a little darker. Still need leadership, but it's a far more coercive style of leadership that's applied. Again, remember, this is a drafted force, not a recruited, not a volunteer force as you have in Starship Troopers. And I think the real distinguishing thing is, at some point in his career, he's put into a hydroponic tank, if you will, and his brain is loaded with thousands of years of military history. Well, there's a shortcut right there to get around all the things you have to actually learn and do. And and that's an important distinction between the two books, I think.
Yes, because in the Forever War, they're able to upload, if you will, the main character, Mandela, with all the information he's missed while he's been gone.
That's correct.
Again, the Earth years are far more. So the decades and years that he's missed, actually centuries, he's caught up on by being plugged in.
That's right.
And they also note a couple of things of the stimulants that they have in their suits and the hypnosis that they can go under.
And both talk about that. Yep. Both Heinlein and Haldeman use that technique.
And with that in mind, that leadership points, going back to the kind of stuff outlined in Starship Troopers, you see a number of these throughout the book where he kind of gives you a little segment. And having been in the military, you can see these all the time. He's talking about when he takes over, he's a third lieutenant, he's a cadet about to go on a mission, and he's going to take over the inventory from the other lieutenant.
That's right.
And he says, I actually want you to lay it all out. And the other lieutenant's like, well, you should just sign it. What do you don't trust me? And so he lays it all out, and sure enough, not everything's there, and the other lieutenant has to pay stuff. But it's those little things of making sure you do things right, even when it might not be the most popular thing.
You can bet that's something that probably happened to Robert Heinlein.
Absolutely. It happened to many of us, where you're trying to do the right thing, but people are like, just trust it. Another one, another couple quotes, he notes throughout Starship Troopers is authority must be tied to responsibility, that authority must be earned in a sense, and then that self-respect is what drives the warrior. And those aren't necessarily things you see in the Forever War.
No, it's not. Again, the perspective in the Forever War, it's a coerced force. It's a force that's fighting, not necessarily against its will, but it's a force that's fighting ultimately, as they learn, under false pretenses. And that probably is important to understand. There's no sense of false pretense in Starship Trooper. Right. The other guy, the bugs, are the bad guys. We're going to fight them to the end, and we're going to win. In the Forever War, we learned that we actually didn't have to fight the war, that we stumbled into it through ignorance, and to use a word that's weighted, but was probably very important to Haldeman in the 70s when he wrote this book, an imperialistic approach. And then at the end, you discover there was actually no reason to have had the war at all. And that's a significant difference than, of course, Starship Trooper.
Well, going back to the perspectives, obviously World War II was a good versus evil type war, and it was a war of ultimate surrender, unconditional surrender. While Vietnam was a much more blurry on good and bad.
And both books reflect that theme. I go back to something we said earlier, that Starship Troopers is a book of the Second World War, total victory. And the Forever War is a dystopian, dark view of warfare based on Vietnam.
Right. And some of the other points, going back to the Forever War and being able to do the time lapses and jumping time. So because the war goes on for so long, it actually doesn't last forever. It does end at the end of the book. Spoiler alert. for the audience. Whoops. But in Starship Troopers, the war does not. You still see it's going on.
But you're at the point, you're fixing the land in Japan,
right? Pretty
if
much,
you will, to put it in World War II terms, at the very end.
We see the war actually end in the Forever War.
Okay.
And they go back to a different planet and try to start over. But what we saw during the conflict, when the main character in the Forever War, Mandela, comes back to Earth and he's trying to get a job, and they realize that he realized he's an infantryman, he's got other science skills that he acquired before. But in the end, pretty much all they're offering him is, hey, you can be a security guard or you can be a security manager. Although
at the very end of the Forever War, he is able to get out. The war ends. He's able to pick up his life again. In that sense, there's a sort of an idyllic, happy ending to the Forever War that you don't really get in Starship Troopers.
Right.
Because Starship Troopers more directly focus on the military experience. The Forever War, just a little broader in terms of its treatment of character and character development.
Right. Right, and it's able to do that because of the time lapse in many ways. And so, looking at again both of them opposing each other, we also see in Starship Troopers kind of saying that it's a little bit more stern on the military side. So you have some quotes in there, something like, "No defense department ever won a war, and you win by attacking." You see that more positive view of the military force. While in the Forever War, it's less clear of what's that looking like.
The Forever War is a far more nuanced approach. Again, if you're going to read them, that's why you want to read both.
Right.
You read Starship Troopers for the clarity of the clarity of the novel and what he means to say. And Heinlein's a great writer, and it's beautifully written. But you want to read the Forever War as a balance to Heinlein's arguments in Starship Troopers.
And they both actually do cover a couple of these concepts rather saliently, like in Starship Troopers, there are a couple lines where it says, you don't be a hero, don't go running after medals.
That's right.
And you see that in the Forever War as well, where it's like, you just need to do your job, complete the mission. You don't need to, go above and beyond. But is that, do you feel like that's a good way to approach leadership? Or should you have to be measured?
I think you have to be measured, and soldiers, Marines have been telling each other those things for hundreds of years. Don't go chasing medals, keep your head down, do what you're supposed to do, and everything will be fine. That's no different. Every infantryman tells every other infantryman those types of things.
Sure, absolutely, no doubt. And then lastly, as we close up the conversation here, General, what are your final major takeaways for each book? The things that if we're going to read them, what should we be looking out for, or if we've already read them?
Sure. So they're both good leadership studies, very different approaches. They're both good works that'll stretch your mind about the future of humanity. So they're both worth reading for those two things. They're both worth reading together because they have different takes on these problems. And that's why I always recommend if you read one, you need to read the other. And they're very good. The one thing I would counsel people is, whatever you do, don't go see the movie Starship Troopers. It's a terrible film. It was made by someone who did not like the novel, and it's worse than a parody. It's just not very good. And I found it to be completely and entirely without value.
Well, and unfortunately, they made like 4 of them. So
they did, but that's never stopped people making movies,
right? Even if it's terrible. So we will stick with the books, and people always say the book's better. In this case, we know for
the book's very, very much better, but they're both worth reading, and I encourage people to read them both.
Well, thank you so much, General.
Thank you, Tad.
And that's going to wrap up this episode of What's Really Happening. We had an intriguing discussion with GNSI's Executive Director and retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. We discussed a pair of very influential science fiction books, Starship Troopers and The Forever War. Both of them written over half a century ago, but still having lasting impacts on thoughts on leadership as well as military operations around the world. We also had the unique perspective from a former Marine general on how those books affected his leadership capabilities. Thanks for spending some time with us today. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, inviting you to join us for our next episode when we find out what's really happening.